Welcome, everybody. Those of you who have heard me before kind of do these introductions, I've often remarked how wonderful these events are because to me they're almost, not really almost, they are like family homecomings. It's always a great pleasure to look around the room and see so many people who you've worked with in the past who are doing such important work themselves and all, pulling together in the same direction, which is not all that common in this country. It's very gratifying, so welcome. Those who know me also have often heard me say that there's so many things in our lives that are providential. Over the course of the last several years, I started doing a lot of First Amendment religious liberty work, pro bono work, originally with Thomas More and then independently on my own, particularly opposing the contraceptive mandate, which we've successfully done for a couple of local closely held private corporations, following the Hobby Lobby example. And it was in the course of that work that I first heard, didn't really even know about, the Archdiocese for the Military Services. Some of you, I think, have heard of it, but I suspect most of you have not. I was fascinated by this. I heard about it in the course of a Heritage Foundation conference call that I was attending, and got to know someone at the First Liberty Institute, which also does religious liberty work, and started to learn about some of the challenges that the military faces, the Catholic chaplains in the military face, simply trying to minister to people like Chris in the military who are really out there fighting for our religious liberty here at home, but not always easily practicing it even within the confines of the military. And it was in the course of that that I also heard about Archbishop Broglio, and I am just extremely happy to introduce him to us and to have him tell us a little bit about his work. The other thing that I think all of you know, at least this has been my experience over and over again, the Catholic Church just somehow brings to the top the most remarkable people, in my opinion. It always just amazes me the background some of these people have, and so let me just spend a few minutes talking about Archbishop Broglio. Born in Cleveland Heights, Ohio, he attended a Catholic grade school, St. Ignatius High School, which I assume is Jesuit. 5 of my 6 children went to a Jesuit high school here in Chicago. Still wonderful teachers, despite what some people say about the Jesuits. Earned a Bachelor of Arts in Classics at Boston College, an STB in Theology, and a doctorate in Canon Law from the Pontifical Gregorian University in Rome. He was ordained to the priesthood on May 19, 1977 at the Chapel of the Immaculate Conception of the North American College in Rome. From 77 to 79, he served as an associate pastor, and from there on forward, he was just on an amazing trajectory. From 1983 to 1987, from 1979 to 1983, Archbishop Broglio attended the Pontifical Ecclesiastical Academy. From 1983 to 1987, he served as the Secretary of the Apostolic Nunciature in Aberdeen, Ivory Coast. From 1987 to 1990, he served as Secretary of the Apostolic Nunciature in Asuncion, Paraguay. From 1990 to 2001, he served as the Chief of Cabinet for Angelo Cardinal Sodano, Secretary of State to His Holiness Pope John Paul II, and Desk Officer for Central America. In February of 2001, he was named the Apostolic Nuncio to the Dominican Republic and the Apostolic Delegate to Puerto Rico. He was ordained as an Archbishop by John Paul II on March 19, 2001. In November of 2007, he was named the 4th Archbishop of the Military Services of the USA, and he was installed on January 25, 2008, the feast of the conversion of St. Paul. He has served as a member of the Board of Directors of the Catholic Relief Services from 2009 to 2011, as chairman of the U.S. CCB Committee for Canonical Affairs and Church Governance, and is a member of the Subcommittee for the Defense of Marriage. He is an observer to the Committee for International Justice and Peace. He's also chaired the task force charged with planning the 2013 Special Assembly of the Conference and was a member of the Subcommittee for Healthcare. Ladies and gentlemen, Archbishop Broglio.
Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for those kind words of introduction. And thank you also for the opportunity to address you this evening. I'm well aware that many of your past speakers were well-known experts in various areas of learning. I feel a little bit like Pat, the inspector of Irish whiskey, who was visiting a distillery. He had to climb a catwalk and make certain that the ingredients were genuine, that the machinery was clean, and that the product was authentic. Pat slipped on the catwalk and fell into a huge vat of whiskey. As you can imagine, there was panic in the distillery, and some of the first responders clambered up the catwalk to save him. They looked down to discover Pat doing the backstroke in the whiskey and praying, "Lord, make me worthy of the task I have received." That prayer is mine this evening as I invite you to look at the issue of religious liberty and the chaplaincy at the present time. You're probably aware of the long tradition of military chaplaincy in the United States. When George Washington accepted the commission from the Continental Congress to be the commander of the United States, or not the United States, but the forces of the 13 original colonies, the first thing he asked the Continental Congress was for permission to have chaplains. And so shortly thereafter, the Congress voted, and they decided that they would have chaplains and that they would have a captain's salary. Of course, as you can imagine, those 20 original chaplains did not include any Catholic priests. In 1776, the presence of Catholics in the colonies was very, very limited. Only Maryland had a large number of Catholics. And so there really weren't any Catholic priests as chaplains until the war with Mexico. President Pierce was concerned that the war be interpreted as a battle between the Protestant United States and the Catholic Mexico. And so he asked the Archbishop of New York, the Bishop of New York, New York was not yet an archdiocese, Bishop Hughes, if he would give him some priests. And Bishop Hughes, like all good diocesan bishops, asked the Jesuits for 2 priests. And he was given Father John McElroy and Father Antonio Rey. Father Rey was killed during the Mexican-American War, and John McElroy went back and founded my alma mater, Boston College. It was really not until the Civil War that there was a large presence of priests on both sides of that battle, or of that war. There were about no more than 20 at any one time, but on both sides. And of course, that's actually where the first appreciation for the difficulties that chaplains faced were revealed. Because, of course, you needed faculties. And every time you moved out of one diocese and into another, you had to obtain faculties. And this was a very complicated issue, especially at the time of the Civil War, especially when you had the Bishop of Richmond who said he would suspend any priest who ministered to a Union soldier. It was a Civil War, so tensions were very high, things that we would not necessarily understand. So in 1917, in the middle of the First World War, the Holy See named the auxiliary bishop of New York to take responsibility for giving faculties to chaplains who would serve in the branches of the military. And he continued that function even when he became Archbishop of New York, and that tradition continued, that the Archbishop of New York was also the military vicar of the United States. It was when John O'Connor was named Archbishop of New York that the two offices were separated. So Archbishop Ryan became the coadjutor of what was then the military vicariate, and John O'Connor became the Archbishop of New York. So the first time we had someone with experience as a military chaplain was also the first time that he was not the military vicar. Archbishop Ryan then, when the Archdiocese for Military Services was founded in 1985, moved the offices from New York to Washington, D.C., where they are presently. Now, when we talk about the Catholic chaplaincy, there are many illustrious figures, and I would like to select just one of them as an illustration. During the Korean conflict, an army chaplain from Pilsen, Kansas, by the name of Father Emile Capon, was captured by the Chinese with some of his men. He was a very bold priest. He actually comes on the scene when the communists are about to shoot a wounded man who's lying in a ditch. And Father Capon pushes the rifle out of the way and carries the man back to what will be the prison camp. And when he could carry him no longer, got one of the other soldiers to help him. And between the two of them, they brought this man back, and he actually survived the prison camp. But Father Capon did not stop there. It was cold. There was not enough to eat. And so the priest immediately began to organize the captives and to breathe some life and hope into their situation. He encouraged them not to lose heart and not to listen to the propaganda that they were being fed. And being a good and resourceful farm boy from the Midwest, he also figured out where they kept the food and stole extra food to keep the men somewhat strong. While he managed to celebrate Mass and to offer the sacraments to the Catholics among the prisoners, the humanitarian efforts knew no religious demarcation. He was truly the chaplain to all. Literally, he died at the service of those prisoners because he gave them some of his own meager rations and was constantly in the sights of his captors. They knew that his approach and his leadership were detrimental to their ability to control the others in the prison camp. He died finally of malnutrition and pneumonia in what was euphemistically referred to as the infirmary of the camp. Years later, when the captives had been freed, after the truce on the 38th parallel, they spoke about this incredible man. His cause for canonization has been opened, and there is at least one miracle under examination. That documentation has been taken to the Congregation for the Causes of Saints, and we expect that sometime this fall his heroic virtues will be recognized. I think that his story is a good image for the notion of religious freedom. I submit that Father Capon, certainly an extraordinary figure, did not care for the needs of all merely because he was endowed with great human qualities, but rather because he understood the depth of the mystery of salvation. We are created in the image and likeness of God, and we are saved in a community. The human person needs to live in society. Society is not for him an extraneous addition, but a requirement of his nature. Through the exchange with others, mutual service and dialogue, man develops his potential. He responds to his vocation. Care for others is a lived expression of our faith. It is not an extra. Freedom of religion is not merely freedom of worship. It is the freedom to live and express our faith consistently, 24/7. Let us look a bit at the landscape today and then consider what the future might bring. At the risk of appearing naive, I do want to assure you that presently Catholic priests and Catholic faithful enjoy freedom of religion in all areas of the Archdiocese for the Military Services of the United States of America. Mass and the sacraments are celebrated regularly on military installations where there is a priest assigned, the Blessed Sacrament is reserved, and religious education takes place. The same is true in the medical centers of the Department for the Veterans Affairs. Obviously, the situation is better in some places than in others, but I suspect that the same could be said of parishes in any area of this country. To put it very simply, that there is religious accommodation is the responsibility of the installation commander. What determines a Catholic program is my responsibility. The armed services in this country also recognize and support religious freedom and the free exercise of religion. While my appointment was made by Benedict XVI, the role is respected by the military, and the parameters that I set for the practice of the Catholic faith are those recognized by the military hierarchy. For a priest to become a chaplain or to fulfill the responsibilities of a contract for a Catholic priest, he must have the endorsement of the Archdiocese. You have all heard, I'm sure, about the controversy of prayer in Jesus' name. You can be certain that in a Catholic context, prayer is offered in the same way it would be in any Catholic setting. When a chaplain prays, however, at a public non-sectarian event, for example, a retirement, a promotion ceremony, every night at 10 p.m. on a Navy ship, and the like, his or her prayer must be inclusive so that all who believe in God can join in or at least feel welcome. This is not rocket science. If you are gathered in an interfaith assembly, you try to encourage the good sentiments of all. I learned that as a little boy, that you did not wish the Jewish neighbors a Merry Christmas. One problem that oppresses the Catholic communities in the 5 branches of the military is the shortage of Catholic priests. Catholics represent about 25% of the military population, but we are only 8% of the chaplain corps. That shortage is due to the reduction in the number of priests in the United States, the fact that the wedge of the pie of those who can be recruited is smaller due to health, fitness, and age. Most Catholic priests are older by the time they are eligible to serve because of the studies that are necessary, and also the requirement that the Archdiocese has that any priest, before he can serve, must spend at least 3 years in a normal parochial assignment in his diocese. Many installations correct the inability to have a uniform priest by providing for a contract priest. Here, too, there are problems. The pool of priests usually retired, is not large, and funding becomes an issue. You can imagine that if you're going to ask a priest to move to Chicago or San Diego, his living expenses will be much greater than, say, in North Dakota or rural Georgia. The individual installation commanders are not always so eager to spend the necessary funds, even though assuring the First Amendment rights to those under their command is their responsibility. How fortunate you and I are to live in a nation founded on principles. They can be fundamental in respecting integrity. If you read the Declaration of Independence, you will discover at the very beginning, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. They are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. It means that our country was not established because of a common ethnic or racial origin, or a common language, or those other elements that characterize many other nations of the world. It is based on certain self-evident truths: life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Liberty and integrity go together. Part of our freedom is the inherent right to follow our conscience. We recognize that when military service was still obligatory for men in this country, it was possible to be dispensed if one conscientiously objected to war or to military service. Today, it is still possible, even for those who have volunteered for military service. And that's one of the services that chaplains provide, is to help someone go through the process if he or she discovers that they really aren't committed to this idea. Just recently, I was introduced to the story of Desmond Doss, a Seventh-day Adventist who volunteered as a medic but refused to bear arms during the Second World War. His life was not easy, especially in basic training, and even as they moved to the Pacific Theater. However, in the midst of a pitched battle to take Hacksaw Ridge, he saved by himself between 50 and 75 men and was awarded the Medal of Honor. He served, but remained faithful to the dictates of his conscience. You and I must make sure that such is always the case for those in the military and those recovering in the medical centers of the Department for Veterans Affairs. It is imperative in contemporary society to protect that sanctuary of the human person's relation and response to his or her God. He must not be forced to act contrary to his conscience, nor must he be prevented from acting according to his conscience, especially in religious matters. So wrote the fathers of the Second Vatican Council in the document on religious liberty. Now, there are challenges. The first of these is health care. What happens when a faithful Catholic is a physician, a nurse, or someone else closely involved with health care and all that that includes in the 21st century? The response is not clear. Conscientious objection in these fields is not quite as simple. and there is tension. Some health care providers feel forced to provide contraception. There is even talk about elective abortion, although that is currently protected by federal legislation, which forbids using federal funds to procure abortions. There is also a well-founded fear that healthcare professionals could be forced into providing therapies related to sex change and related issues. At the moment, those issues are under study, but the danger is present. In these instances, I have usually referred those healthcare professionals who approach me to the well-trained and professional staff of the National Catholic Bioethics Center. These experts can counsel the military professionals on an appropriate moral stance and make clear the classic distinction of moral theology between formal material cooperation and indirect material cooperation. Formal material cooperation in evil is always sinful. However, the ability to object is often based on your rank. The colonel or the Navy captain can bring more weight to his position than the poor lieutenant. I do not defend that situation, but it is the reality. Good Catholics with rank are willing to counsel and help those of a lower rank. That is extremely helpful. I maintain that those who follow their conscience and resist the pressure are also heroes. They are a new version of Desmond Doss. The Conscience Protection Act, passed by the United States House of Representatives, would codify and make permanent a judicial cause of action for citizens and insurance companies forced to participate in abortion. However, I am not certain that this bill will fare well in the Senate. Tertullian already noted the special dignity of the human person in relationship to law and considered it a distinguishing characteristic of the rational being. Alone among all animate beings, the human person can boast of having been counted worthy of receiving a law from God. As an animal endowed with reason, capable of understanding and discernment, he or she is to govern their conduct by using their freedom and reason in obedience to the one who has entrusted everything to them. We remember the question of God to Cain after he had killed his brother Abel. Cain avoids a direct response, but rather poses a question: am I my brother's keeper? In a literal sense, it remains unanswered, but very clearly, the response is affirmative. From the beginning, Almighty God reminds us that we are responsible for our brothers and sisters. We do not live in a vacuum. The person with nothing in Africa is my responsibility. So also the victim of injustice is my responsibility, and I must do what I can to remedy the injustices of our world. During the last ad limina visit of U.S. bishops in 2012, or maybe 2011, Pope Benedict XVI recalled the consensus about the nature of reality and the moral good and the conditions for human flourishing at the heart of every culture. He said, and I quote, "In America, that consensus is enshrined in your nation's founding documents, was grounded in a worldview shaped not only by faith, but by a commitment to certain ethical principles deriving from nature and nature's God. We all recognize how much that consensus has eroded, but at least the community of faith is obliged to foster a culture of truth and to encourage all men and women to cultivate the highest moral principles. The basic Judeo-Christian framework to our society in this country cannot be denied. It might be politically incorrect at present, but it is impossible not to see it. I'm reminded of a conversation with the command group at an air base several years ago. They had recently entertained some guests from an Arab ally. In the course of the visit, they very proudly showed him a video which depicted the rescue of one American captive. At the end of the video, the guests were overwhelmed and said, "Why would you endanger the lives of 30 men to save one? That is stupid." My host said that they told their interlocutors that not leaving anyone behind was what we Americans do. The guests still remained perplexed. I'm afraid that I could not resist the teachable moment, and I immediately pointed out that what we Americans do is based on the Judeo-Christian concept of the innate worth of the human person. It's not a problem to be solved by mathematics. We've got 1 here and 30 there. But it's inscribed in our DNA, is that notion of the uniqueness of each human person created in the image and likeness of God and worth the effort to save. Catholics, and perhaps many other believers, would clearly add that such worth applies to every human person from the moment of conception to natural death. It also explains our concern for the poor, the homeless, the immigrant, the aged, and anyone else whose dignity is questioned. Certainly another challenge that faces us is the recognition of same-sex unions as the equivalent of marriage in law. Like many other faith traditions with chaplains in the armed forces and the Department of Veterans Affairs, the Catholic Church will not accept this equivalency. Up to the present, First Amendment rights prevail, and no chaplain can be forced to do something which his faith forbids. Chaplains and priests immediately asked me to spell out clearly what they are allowed to do. Obviously, there must be pastoral charity for all, not a response of hate, but a response of authentic love. And so my initial response tried to be pastoral, but very clear. There is no contradiction, because in our tradition, pastoral service is always born from doctrine. However, there are so many situations and ramifications of the Supreme Court decision that I find myself continually responding to concrete situations. And in the near future, I will have to revise my initial policy so that it includes guidance for situations about which I had not thought. What is important to retain is that priests cannot be ordered or forced to violate their conscience. they must be defended at all costs. Curiously, frequently when I visit military installations, I'm pulled aside by the Protestant chaplains who thank me for taking a stand because they don't feel that they have anyone who speaks for them. And so I'm happy to fulfill that function as well. I'm not certain what tomorrow will bring. One thing is certain. The Archdiocese for the Military Services will continue to promote sound doctrine and protect the rights of Catholics in the military. I confess that when I accepted the idea of being assigned as the Archbishop for the Military Services, which was proposed to me on the 1st of October 2007, I would never have dreamed that the role would include defending the religious freedom of Catholics in the military or the VA system. I knew that there was a shortage of priests, and I would soon discover that the Archdiocese was near bankruptcy, but these other challenges were unperceived. While I would much prefer to talk about the good done by Catholics in the Archdiocese entrusted to my pastoral care, there is a certain obligation to make people aware of some threats to our ability to live according to the precepts of our faith. Religious liberty means much more than the freedom of worship. It means the ability to live as faithful Catholics in every moment of every day. In that Ad Limina discourse cited earlier, Pope Benedict was very clear. He said, "The Church's witness is of its nature public. She seeks to convince by proposing rational arguments in the public square. The legitimate separation of church and state cannot be taken to mean that the church must be silent on certain issues, nor that the state may choose not to engage or be engaged by the voices of committed believers in determining the values which will shape the future of the nation." I'm reminded of a very dramatic discourse by St. John Paul II in the presidential palace of Paraguay in the presence of the dictator Alfredo Stroessner, when he said basically that religion cannot be corralled in the sacristies because it is a part of the heart of every human person. I'm reminded of my first year as a seminarian in Rome. An important 19th century justice building was closed because it was unsafe. It seemed to be sinking into the ground. Yet the Colosseum, the Pantheon, and the ruins of the Roman Forum were all still standing and could be visited. It was a good reminder that not everything contemporary is good, and that stable foundations are essential. Thomas More, whose relics, by the way, are at the St. John Paul II Shrine in Washington as I speak, taught that with the ultimate sacrifice, that integrity is essential to the authenticity of the human person. As you know, he went to the executioner's platform saying, "I die the king's good servant, but God's first." May all of us recommit ourselves to that fundamental integrity which allows us to sleep peacefully at night, look honestly in the mirror, and contribute to the potential greatness of a human person. If Thomas More teaches us anything, it is the fundamental value of personal integrity. There is still much more Irish whiskey to be consumed in the vat, but I hope that I have at least touched on some of the key concerns of a shepherd who finds himself charged with assuring the pastoral care of 1.8 million Catholics in the armed forces, in the Department of Veterans Affairs, and those who serve the federal government outside the U.S. borders and their families. Thank you very much.
If you still have questions, feel free to bring them up, but we have a couple we'll start with. Well, this one might need some elaboration, but the question is, has the VA situation gotten better?
That's a very good question, and there are probably some other people in here who could answer the question better than I can. But a very wise man told me when I first took over the Archdiocese, he said, when you've seen one VA, you've seen one VA. So it depends very much. There are 153 VA hospitals throughout the United States, in Puerto Rico and Guam. And it very much depends. They are fairly independent the way they're organized. Much depends on the individual director. So some are very good, some are not so good. And that also, of course, affects pastoral care as well, because sometimes the chaplains are not under the department that you would normally expect them to be under. So it really depends from VA to VA.
Maybe a follow-up of my own Archbishop. I've heard it proposed that vouchers be used more widely, that many veterans have to drive, past multiple hospitals because they have to go to the Veterans Administration. What is your thought about that?
That has been proposed, and actually that probably would be a very good solution, because it would provide the care, it would be funded by the federal government, as it should be, but that it would leave the individual freer to choose the hospital that's closer to him or her.
And then another question, how is the Archdiocese funded?
Someone will think that I planted that question. The Archdiocese is funded by free will offerings, so it has no real visible means of support. We can only take up 4 designated offerings a year on a military installation, and that would never meet the needs, the financial needs of the Archdiocese. So we're funded by the Knights of Columbus, who are very generous. We're funded by Catholic Extension, hence my presence in Chicago this week, the same week that they have the Mission Bishops Conference. We're funded by Home Missions. We're funded by direct mail, so I make appeals. My development department makes appeals. My advancement department makes appeals. I guess that's the nice word we're supposed to use now. That are sent out 4 times a year asking for donations, and that's a very effective method. Then the Archdiocese looks for grants for specific projects. And finally, 4 years ago, my brother bishops, at the request of the then Archbishop of Denver, who's now the Archbishop of Philadelphia, passed a resolution that allows a collection, a national collection for the Archdiocese for Military Services every 3 years. And that collection, at the discretion of the local bishop, will be taken up this year, so usually around Veterans Day. So those are the sources of our funding.
How are chaplains trained, or what is the training to provide grief counseling and support to forward deployed troops who suffer losses of fellow troops?
Well, that would be one of the fundamental responsibilities that a chaplain has. So he receives some training for that in chaplain school, and obviously, those that come from religious traditions that have, a strong, strong preparation in that regard will also bring all of that richness, and also the richness of an individual's experience. So all of that is brought to chaplain. In terms of chaplain training, in addition to the seminary training, they're trained as officers, so they do the basic officer candidate training, And then they also go to the chaplain school, which at the moment is at Fort Jackson in South Carolina. The Air Force is going back to Maxwell at Montgomery, Alabama, and the Navy is going back to Newport, which will leave just the Army at Fort Jackson. And that's where the chaplains then receive their training before they go on active duty, or the reserves.
Can I ask a question?
I don't know, Marianne. It has to be in writing.
You probably are aware of the issues where the soldier was invited to the flag holding ceremony for a friend who was retiring, and because the prayer that he did mention God, he was removed forcibly from the stage. And I wonder if you'd like to comment on that, and also the officer who was investigated for having an open Bible on his desk.
Yeah. I could certainly comment authentically on the first case. I probably received the same email that many of you received with the pictures describing this event. And I picked up the phone and called the chaplain at Travis Air Force Base, which is where this happened. And that chaplain is a Catholic priest. He happened to be the wing chaplain. He's now my chancellor. And he told me that what was exposed there is not true. The man was not invited by the person who was retiring. He came of his own accord and basically provoked the incident himself. So despite what was sent around, it just doesn't correspond to what actually happened. In terms of, there was actually a reversal. I don't know if it's the same case, but there was a reversal of the decision about the officer who had a Bible on, I can't remember if it was his or her desk, and that was, it went up through the chain of command, and they said no, that he or she could have a religious book on the desk. That's not a violation of. Unfortunately, we have an organization in the United States, which I conveniently always forget the official name of it, but it exists to protect people from religion. It also exists to make sure that the director keeps his $300,000 annual salary. And when the till is getting low, this gentleman looks for cause, and his approach is always the same. He writes to the superior of the institution where he has found this supposed violation, particularly if it's from the Air Force, because he's a retired Air Force officer and a retired Air Force Academy grad. And then if that doesn't produce a response, he threatens a lawsuit. I don't know that he's ever won a lawsuit. And finally, he threatens to take it to the news media. And of course, all of this serves to people who share his concern, then contribute to his foundation, and the till is then in better financial state than it was before.
I think this will be the last one. What is being proposed or discussed regarding a Muslim's fidelity to Sharia law as opposed to fidelity to the U.S. Constitution?
Wow.
In 20 words or less.
And 20 words or less. Well, you all, I'm sure everyone in this room knows that the basis of the oath that any serviceman takes, or servicewoman, any military person takes to begin military service is to protect and defend the Constitution. It's very similar to the oath that the President of the Republic takes. So that has to supersede certainly anything that would be contrary to the Constitution. So Sharia, you know, it has a variety of interpretations as well, and that's another problem because, of course, unlike the Catholic Church, where we have you know, people who are charged to be to govern, sanctify. We don't have that in the Muslim world. So any imam is a pope to himself. He can determine what Islam says and what Islam does not say. And so that puts you in a very certain difficulty. I've met a number of imams who are chaplains in the military. They're all, at least they're all very fine people, and certainly very cooperative, very respectful. But that's just been my experience, which obviously would be somewhat limited. And usually I've met them in places where they've been hand-selected, the academies, places where they want to be very sure who's doing what. But that would be the way I would respond to that question.